So I am Kate McNelly. I am a recent graduate from UC Irvine. I did my PhD at UCI and I just finished back in June 2020. So I am a pandemic graduate. I transitioned to a career as a lecturer at Emory University. So I am a teaching track faculty member here at Emory. And I did a lot of specifications grading with Steve Mang, Renee Link, and William Howitz, who you heard from last week. And I have been still doing specifications grading here at Emory. So I'm excited to talk to you today. I'll let Steve introduce himself.
So hi, everybody. I'm Steve Mang. I'm an assistant professor of teaching at UC Irvine. I've been here about 5 years. And before that, I was a lecturer in the chemistry department at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. And so at UCI, I have responsibility for upper division lab classes and chemistry writing classes. And so you'll hear about both of those things. All right, so we want to start with acknowledgements. We have a lot of people to thank for this because this has sort of been a, you're going to hear about a lot of different applications of specifications grading, and we have learned a lot, both through trial and error and from other people during this process. So at UC Irvine, we want to thank, first of all, Sergey Niskordov, who's here. He was the first one who, he sort of shepherded the creation of the writing class that we're going to talk about, developed the first syllabus, did the first proposal, all that good stuff. Dr. Renee Link is also here, and she was the one who introduced me to specifications grading and gave me the idea to sort of start implementing it in various classes that I have responsibility for. Chris and Maddie, there in the bottom left, were my TAs for an instrumental analysis class and helped me do my first incursion into specs grading. And then Mike Morris and Haley Glicker both TA'd and taught as instructors of record the writing class that you're going to hear about, and helped refine the specifications grading system quite a bit.
All of those people at UCI were very instrumental in helping Steve and I craft the writing class, and then help Steve craft his 152 class that he's going to talk about. I wanted to thank Dr. William Howitz over at Georgia Tech, and then two grad students at Emory, Savannah Post and Cassie Strank, for helping me design and implement my new course that I have been doing here at Emory. So with that, we also want to thank the Teaching Academy for having us here today and including us in our webinar series. So to start, if you've been following the webinar series and we see a bunch of familiar faces, you saw that Dr. Renee Link talked about kind of an overview of specs and gave us the benefits of specs and what it should be doing and how it is helpful for student learning. Last week, you saw William Howitz talk about how you can incorporate parts of specifications grading into your class, specification grading or mastery learning. And now today, Steve and I are going to talk about how did we actually implement a full conversion of specifications grading, first with a class that we developed together, and then with two classes that we have since done on our own. So we're going to practice what we preach here, and we're going to start with learning outcomes. What should you get at the end of this seminar? So after the end of this talk, you will be able to explain how assessments, rubrics, and student grade trackers work together to determine a student's grade. Tie how learning outcomes are specified as discrete rubric criteria for course assignments. Think about how many rubric criteria students must actually meet to demonstrate a level of mastery, proficiency, or competency on any given assignment. Reflect on the challenges of translating an existing rubric for an existing course, that is rubrics, assignments, their grading system, etc., to specifications grading. And then based on what our students said, we're hoping to help you anticipate and predict how your own students would react to specification grading. So as we mentioned before, this whole seminar series is predicated on mastery learning and specifications grading. So I'm not going to go too much in depth into what is specs grading, but just to remind us all and to kind of focus in on why specifications grading really was useful for a writing focused class. We're going to talk a little bit about that. So in general, mine and Steve's philosophy is that grading is meant to reflect student achievement of course learning outcomes. Now, points-based grading systems are not ideal for grading writing systems or writing set assignments because it is difficult to objectively assess qualitative student work. It is difficult to equate points with student learning outcomes. And from now on, I will be referring to learning outcomes, student learning outcomes, as LOs. And in general, students are motivated to accumulate points instead of actually learning and meeting course learning outcomes. There's a lot of literature that supports all of these inadequacies. So specifications grading, or I will be referring it often as specs grading for short, is a newer grading system that is meant to be more transparent by actually defining the criteria students must meet to obtain certain SLOs. It is meant to be more equitable through transparency and providing flexible options for students to actually meet those course SLOs. It should make grading more objective by removing the need for partial credit. It should focus on student learning as opposed to just students earning points and point grubbing. And in theory, it should help reduce student anxiety about their grades because of the transparency. And Steve and I will talk about whether or not we actually saw that with our own students. So when designing a specs grading system, and these are kind of the tenets we'll be talking about as we talk about the 3 courses that we have redesigned separately and together. There are many things that go into a specifications grading system, but there are 3 major components that are intimately linked together, and you have to consider them kind of holistically to really design your class. Those components are your bundles of assignments. So what assignments are you actually going to group together to address specific course SLOs? You have to think about your specifications grading rubrics, how you're going to assign them and what assignments you are going to tie rubrics to. And then your grading thresholds for individual assignments. So how do you set grading thresholds for the individual assignments that are graded with specs rubrics? Then how do you set grading rubrics at the course level to actually, so students can achieve or demonstrate learning of or achievement of their SLOs? And all of these components work together. And as you see here, we're going to demonstrate how we kind of start with one, but then we have to consider another, and we go back and forth, and it's an iterative process until your course kind of comes together as a whole.
So with keeping in mind that we'll try not to repeat ourselves too much, we are going to talk about how we worked through those 3 steps for 3 different courses. And so as Kate mentioned, the first one that we're going to talk about is this writing class, Chemistry 101W, Writing for Chemists. Because it's the one where we first really worked through all of these problems and designed the whole class around specifications grading. Then I will talk about an upper division chem lab class that I teach, instrumental analysis, where I did not redesign the course from scratch, but instead just changed the grading system all at once over to specifications grading. And then Kate will talk about her Chem 204L class, a biochemistry lab class at Emory, where she did redesign an upper division lab course around a specifications grading system. So hopefully one of these situations will apply to you, or at least you can learn from our, not always mistakes and successes, let's say, and then envision how you could apply this to your class. So the first, when we decided to redesign this course, we needed to have a purpose for this. And redesigning the course actually did not start with specifications grading, but as we considered the course redesign, specifications grading seemed to be the best way to go. So the issues that we were having, we taught the class a couple of times in just a sort of regular grading system, kind of like a regular chemistry writing class. And it was clear after these first couple of times that students were having a real difficulty with writing in an appropriate way, because they weren't connecting writing like a chemist to skills they had already learned in their lower division writing requirement classes. In other words, we were trying to teach them too many things at once. We were trying to teach them their prior knowledge and also teach them how to write like a chemist. So this prior knowledge that we were hoping they would bring to the class were things like correct standard English grammar, things like maintaining a consistent tense as you write, writing with an audience in mind, which is something that chemistry writing students famously struggle with. developing thesis statements, and then building a coherent narrative, editing at the sentence level, turning sentences into paragraphs, and then turning paragraphs into a whole document. So we needed a way to help them focus on these things and then also teach them how to write like chemists. So as we redesigned the course, we realized that the first thing we needed to do was make it clear to the students what we valued in their submissions. What do we want them to do? What do we want them to demonstrate to us? And as the course that I was working with as of fall 2018 was not clear in terms of its student learning outcomes at the assignment level. There were very broad learning outcomes for the course, but it was not clear to students how those were connected to the expectations on any one assignment. So we wanted to make those things clear and explicit at the course level and also at the individual assignment level. There were rubrics previously, but as Kate mentioned, it's difficult to give partial credit on a rubric to a writing assignment. And there was too much of that going on. There were too few criteria on the rubrics, and the amount of partial credit was too big. And so students were sort of guessing, will this submission earn me 15 out of 20 points or 17 out of 20 points? And the TAs and I were unclear on that as well. It was not consistent from grader to grader. We wanted to increase the amount of feedback that we gave to students, and then give them more opportunities for revision, because research and teaching writing sense revision is hugely important. You have to give them more chances to demonstrate mastery. And then sort of like a less chemistry relevant goal, we realized from the previous class that students just didn't really seem comfortable writing. They didn't seem comfortable with getting a task, working over a semi-long period of time to accomplish that task with a goal in mind. So they didn't know how to be writers. And that's, not unusual for college students, but we thought that one of the valuable things that we could teach them in this class was how to develop a writing process, how to become better writers, not just how to learn how to write about chemistry or how to write a CV or how to write a cover letter. So we decided that using a specifications grading framework would make this easier, especially the part about clarity and rubrics. And so you've seen this slide before about the different types of specification gradings if you watched Renee's talk. And the kind of specifications grading system that we settled on is the one on the right here: equal objectives with repetition and difficulty. So the idea is that there are many kinds of assignments, and most of those assignments assess at least one learning outcome of the course. The assignments have their own individual learning outcomes as well. And then students get more practice, more chances to practice over and over so that they can work up to demonstrating mastery, even if they're not there right away. So we decided on a specifications grading system, and then there are a bunch of questions that we need to address. So for example, what are the important assessments in the course? In our writing class, we have to require 4,000 words of edited, polished writing. And so how are we going to break that down? Are we going to make one big final paper, or what we ended up doing is 4 1,000 word papers? And then you consider all the kinds of assignments in the class. So those 4,000 word papers constitute an assignment bundle. Here's a similar kind of assignment with similar learning objectives. And then we have, smaller 300 to 500 word writing assignments that the students do more regularly. That's another bundle. Reading check-ins, did they do the weekly reading or not? Another bundle. And then once you have your bundles of assignments identified, you need to figure out how they contribute to the student's overall course grade. This is something everybody does when they write their syllabus, right? You say 20% of the grade is on homework and 30% of the grade is on the midterms, and et cetera. So now you're just looking at it in a different way. How many assignments do you need to demonstrate satisfactory performance on or demonstrate mastery on? Okay. And then the last thing you have to consider is, what is a grade in this class supposed to mean? As Kate mentioned this before, you need to decide what is an A? What do students have to be able to do when you're saying this student earned an A in my class versus, okay, they just want to get out of there with a C. What do they have to show you that they can do? And what's the stuff that's kind of not so important, nice to know, but not vital for passing? And so then all of these things, as Kate mentioned, you're kind of going around in this circle. you decide, okay, what's nice to have, and then you say, do I have assignments that address that, and et cetera.
So we've talked about, what are our motivations and goals for our class. Where does our specs system actually fall into this? And then here are questions that we consider along the way when we actually develop our specs grading system. So now we're going to talk about what did we actually do. So what did Steve and I do in our writing for chemists class that we're going to call Chem 101W? So we wanted to help our students see the connections between the previous writing experiences that they had and actually help them learn a writing practice. So we incorporated exercises, adapted exercises from a nonfiction writing textbook called The Writer's Practice that help them really learn, okay, how do I come up with my own process of writing? How do I make a practice? How do I stick to it? And how do I translate this to classes beyond the chemistry course? But to be clear, we did amend them to make sure that they were focused on STEM topics and STEM writing. We then wanted to address, okay, we want to provide clear and consistent rubrics for our students. So we designed new specifications grading rubrics where each item, each criteria on the rubric matches the learning objective, and we have a binary grading system. So for each criteria, the student either meets that criteria or they do not meet that criteria. We also wanted more transparency in how students could actually demonstrate achievement of LOs. And so that is where the bundling of assignments come in, and it comes in the form of a student grade tracker. So we actually give the student grade tracker to students at the beginning of the course so that they know exactly, okay, how many assignments are part of this course, how many do I have to pass, and at what passing thresholds. We also wanted to incorporate, giving students opportunities to learn from their mistakes, as well as account for just things like, when life happens, like when this whole pandemic happens and everything kind of cascades, how do you account for that with your students and your course design? And that's where the token economy comes in. So we have all these components that we need to address. And for Steve and I in particular, we ended up starting with our course grade bundles. So we looked at all these components and said, okay, where are we going to start? We're going to start with our course bundles because from a backwards course design perspective, that made the most sense to us. We started with our overall broad. Here are our course learning objectives. How are we going to tie assignment bundles or assessment types to those learning objectives? So we had 4 major course learning objectives. One about having students actually understand the habits and practices of successful writers and helping them adopt the ones that work for them. We wanted them to create professional papers, proposals, reports, and other forms of scientific writing to really tie in this writing requirement to a discipline-specific course. We wanted them to learn how to efficiently search the chemical literature and actually find sources that were relevant to chemistry researchers. And then how do they communicate those results? So as we mentioned, this was a course redesign. So we already had a lot of assessments in place, and then we also adapted some from the writer's practice to fit into these bundles. So we looked at all of our assignments and we decided, okay, for most of these assignments, they are in pretty discrete bundles already, right? We have small assignments, writing assignments, reading check-ins, in-class assignments, all of these different levels, and they're already gradated pretty finely. So we decided we were going to keep these as our assessment bundles, except for the small assignments and writing reflections, which essentially were the same thing, and we were assessing with the same type of rubrics. So we put those into the same bundle. So this is how we decided to bundle the different types of assignments into the criteria for the student grade tracker. So we're at this part of our course component design here. Now that we have our course bundles, the next thing to decide was, okay, how do we actually set grading thresholds for the course? So we're thinking about the course level grading thresholds right now, as opposed to the individual assignment ones. And this is a representative view of what we decided to do. So in reality, we actually did a gradation from A+, A minus, B+, B, and so on. We're just going to show these these 2 representative ones here, an A and a B. And we decided that we were going to assess some of our assignments a little bit differently than others. So you can see that for these two in particular up here, the small writing assignments and the 1,000-word writing assignments, we have different passing thresholds that students must meet to earn different letter grades. In this case, we used a 3-level or a trinary system where we had a high pass, a low pass, and a needs revision. And that might not make sense yet, but we're going to show you our rubrics and clarify what that means in a minute. We had other assignments where we didn't actually use a 3-level system. We just used binary, pass or not pass, or really complete or incomplete. And there were reasons for both of these. These reading check-ins and the complete and incomplete assignments were assignments that were helping students learn the learning outcomes that we wanted them to achieve, but they weren't necessarily assessing them. So they had to complete these assignments in order to actually learn the material and try to pass the class. But since they weren't assessing anything, and really it was just a major of learning objective of teach the students how to do this, we didn't have any rubrics and we didn't have any defined like passing thresholds besides just complete and incomplete. For the assignments that actually were assessed for measuring the student outcomes, those are the things like the small writing assignments and the large writing assignments that tied to those bigger learning objectives. So for those, we had rubrics. I'm going to show you an example of a rubric in a minute. Rubrics that have different criteria on them, and students have to meet a certain number of those to get a different passing threshold. Now, we found that this system worked pretty well, but we wanted to caution you against something that we have learned in this system. So the very first time we ran Chem 101W, it was a small course. There were about 20 students, and we didn't put in enough gradations into the difference between an A minus, B plus, for example, to really distinguish between how many assignments students need to get a high pass on versus low passes. And this is particularly relevant for this assignment bundle here, the small writing assignments. The other ones, they were more or less okay, but we were blindsided, for example, when a student approached us and we're like, well, the criteria for an A is to get 17 high passes and 1 low pass. Whereas the criteria to get a B was, 15 high passes and 2 low passes. But I got 16 high passes, and I actually completed 3 assignments with a low pass, even though we only have to do 18. And we realized there were some holes there. So we had to then adjust and kind of fix it and make it work for our classes. So we're telling you this as a caution. There was a reason we used this 3-level system, and there's a purpose behind it, and there's a purpose behind why Steve and I are still using it. But there may be holes that you have to try to anticipate or amend the way that you construct your grade tracker, so that way you try to not have holes in it. So I keep mentioning this high pass, low pass system. What does that even mean? Well, it ties into our rubrics. So we just talked about our course bundles, and we talked about how to set grading thresholds at the course level. Really, that ties in now to how we design our specifications grading rubrics. So this is an example of a specifications grading rubric that we have for our small writing assignments. And the way that we design these is that each criteria is a specific learning outcome that we want the students to meet. So when we're actually grading the assignment, we can go through and say, okay, did the students actually have writing that was grammatically correct? Yes, okay, they met it. No, okay, they didn't meet it. Now, here's where another caveat comes in. With this rubric system, the very first time we ran it, we didn't account for any errors in grammar, for example. And we realized that this was a little inequitable for students who, for example, don't have English as their first language. So then we started changing this a little bit to account for that. So we accounted for 3 or more errors, something like that. But we wanted to hold the students to a standard and then help them learn from their mistakes so then they can grow and meet the learning outcomes. So back to this rubric. Here is an example of a full rubric, and we tried to be consistent in our rubrics in that this is a small assignment rubric, and we use this rubric for more or less all of the small writing assignments in that course bundle. And that was intentional because we wanted to make sure that we were consistent, we were clear, and we were helping scaffold students as they learned this material. So every assignment they saw very similar criteria, so then they could really demonstrate proficiency and then even levels of mastery later on. And you'll see that this is a rubric that has 10 criteria. So there are 10 criteria. They are binary. Each one, the student either meets it or they don't. And then that ties in, how do we actually set the passing threshold for the individual assignments? So we had to figure out, okay, how are we going to define competency versus proficiency for single assignments? So on our course LMS, we did this at UCI. I believe Steve still does this at UCI, and I'm doing it now at Emory, where on every single assignment, we use Canvas. On every single assignment, at the bottom of the assignment, we have a little blurb to remind the students that this is a specifications grading rubric. It is different than what they are used to. This ties into how we have to constantly remind students that this is how you use the system. This is how you read the rubrics. This is how you read the points, because it is so new. So that is something that you have to consider if you are going to be switching to a full-blown specs grading course. So we have our blurb. We also have information on what do the students need to meet to get a high pass, a low pass, or a needs revision. And these correspond to the number of rubric criteria. So if I go back here, you'll see there are 10 rubric criteria. So to get a high pass, they need to have met 8 out of 10 of those rubric criteria, and then they get a high pass. Now you might say, well, why is that a 2? Unfortunately, on our course LMS, on Canvas, we cannot actually have grades that are called high pass, low pass, or needs revision. So we have to use the system that we have, and that means we use points. So a high pass is 2 points, a low pass is 1 point, and a needs revision is 0. And I don't actually refer to them as points in my class. It's more just needs revision equals 0, and try and minimize the emphasis on points, because that's not really what we're going for. So this is how we did it. And really, if you were to do this, how you set your thresholds is up to you. It really depends on the assignment type and the number of LOs that you have for your course. For us, we wanted to let the students demonstrate a level of competency. So we set a low pass in general to about a 70% of the rubric criteria satisfied. We then set a high pass to a level of proficiency, so about 80 to 90% of the rubric criteria satisfied. If instead we had done a binary rubric where we only have 2 levels, we have pass or not pass or satisfactory needs revision, then generally you would set proficiency to about 80%. And that is actually how we did it in Renee's class at UCI, where she just had a 2-level system where students either pass or they don't pass. And then based on the number of passes that you get on assignments, that will kind of lead towards the gradations on the assignment bundles, going towards an A, a B, a C, etc. So we wanted to give students the opportunity to actually demonstrate competency. So that's why we use this 3-level system. And when I talk about my class, I'll talk about another reason why the 3-level system actually worked better in my case than having a 2-level system.
So we should point out that if you don't want to deal with a 3-level system, 2-level systems are by far the norm in specifications grading classes with writing assignments in them. Especially if you're offering enough revision, it's a totally defensible way to go. If you're offering students opportunity to turn that needs revision into a satisfactory score, then 2-level systems are reasonable, and people use them a lot. So here, these are a couple of examples in the literature, but there are others also. So I see a question in the chat. How do you give specific feedback to the student about limitations? So in the grading rubric in Canvas, we use Canvas. We actually build the rubric in like a Canvas rubric, so that the grader can click either a box that says criteria met or a box that says criteria not met. And in that box, there's a space for instructor comments. And so they can type in, here's why you didn't meet this criteria, or here's what you did well about this criteria, for example. They can also in Canvas leave, like in the document, they can leave annotations about specific places. Here's a mistake, here's the criteria that this goes along with. So that's being graded in the LMS. All right, so Kate mentioned that we have a token economy in the class, and this is going along with the the course goal, the course redesign goal that we had about giving students a lot of revision opportunities. So the token economy is just an intangible token system. Everybody starts with 3, and then they can earn more by doing things that we want them to do. So completing surveys about the class or about the grading system, keeping a journal article reading diary, turning in reflections on assignment revisions. In other classes, we might do quiz corrections. Okay. And then they can spend the tokens for things that they want. Extra time to turn in assignments past the normal deadline extensions that we would just give anyway because we're so nice. Revision opportunities beyond what they get, the ones that are built into the class. If they want to spend a lot of tokens, they can just bump up their grade on one assignment without doing a resubmission because, as Kate said before, stuff happens. So somebody asked in the chat, have we compared this to previous classes? Or about the grading of one of the older classes. So in 101W, we've had the same people TA the class and teach the class with and without the grading system. And for that class, we have sort of like general impressions that the specifications grading courses, the writing got better over the course of the quarter than it did in the old system. For Chem 152, I've actually had some TAs go back and reevaluate lab reports. And yes, it does get better. Students improve more than they did with the old system. And in a minute, I'll talk about why I think that is. So we have given students surveys about this grading system. And this is both mine and Kate's favorite quote that we've ever seen on a student survey, which is that I personally dislike this grading method, but I admit that it forces me to improve my writing skills. It's very easy to get students to say the first half of that quote about any grading system or class system, flipped classroom, anything that's not the norm of lecture and tests or lecture and assignments with rubrics. It is not so easy to get students to realize the second part of that, which is that they are encouraged, let's say, to improve. We don't want to feel like we're forcing them to do anything, but we made our expectations clear that we expect them to get a grade and not see that as the endpoint, but see it as an opportunity to incorporate feedback and improve their output, their writing. So we also, in addition to soliciting free response questions, we asked Likert scale questions about students' motivation for writing practices, academic motivation in general, study strategies and learning strategies. And these were mostly inconclusive. Any significant effects that were seen were like really, really small, and we don't feel comfortable making any claims based on them. But what we can certainly say is that specs grading doesn't lead to any worse outcomes, and it has a lot of advantages that to the extent that we are converts. We use this in all our classes now. So some trends in these student responses that we've been able to identify over all the offerings of Chem 101W. Students knew what we wanted, and they knew what they needed to do to get the grade that they want. So some students are comfortable shooting for a B. Some students want that A+. In either case, they're confident that they know what they have to do to get that grade. They felt like they improved their writing process. Students identified that consistent feedback was letting them know which parts of writing they struggled with and where they needed to fix that. Is it an idea generation problem, or is it a proofreading and polishing problem, etc. They liked the idea that they could do multiple drafts, and they liked the idea that they had some agency over how they improved in the class with the token system. Negative comments grouped into sort of well, first of all, they just didn't agree with how we set the passing thresholds. They thought it was too hard to get a high pass or too hard to get an A. I've never taught a class where that wasn't the case with any grading system. Same thing, they say it's too easy to drop a grade level. If I get a bad grade, it's gonna hurt my grade too much. Again, very common student complaint. Usually it's about midterms instead of a writing assignment, but same idea. But then, another thing was that students felt that the grading system didn't adequately reward the effort and the time that they spent, which is a valid complaint, but what it speaks to is a student buy-in issue. We tried our best, we tried really hard to make it clear that our expectations for the students were that were not that they spent a lot of time on the class, not that they were perfect the first time they did everything, but that they worked to improve their writing and their writing process. And we always start out in this class by emphasizing that that takes a lot of time. Writing is this iterative process that is never perfect the first time or even the second time that you write something down. We need to sell that better, clearly. It's not really a limitation of the grading system. It's more of a limitation of how do you convince students that the way to improve their writing is to work a lot on their writing. And that's a difficult question.
So ultimately, we came out of our 101W experiences learning a lot and learning what we had to apply to other classes. So essentially, we demonstrated how specs grading really helped us achieve the goals of our course redesign through giving us the flexibility of being more transparent with our assignment rubrics, which the students appreciated, and also being able to be clear about what the students needed to meet in the course in order to get a certain letter grade. So one thing that students didn't like was that they didn't feel like there were enough revision opportunities. So the first iteration of 101W, we had all of the reattempt and resubmission opportunities tied to tokens, as opposed to being tied to just the assignment, intrinsically in the assignment. Like they have to do one assignment and then resubmit it, get feedback, and then do it again. So we decided that in the next iteration of 101W, we wanted to incorporate more of those revision opportunities that were purposefully part of assignments as opposed to just being used with tokens. Before I show the next bullet point, I'm going to remind you that one of the goals of specs grading is to have students to be less stressed about their grades. Unfortunately, students were still a little bit stressed out, and I think in this case, it was because of the new system, and they were unfamiliar with how to use it and how to actually track the grade. And so this led us in later iterations of our courses to really try to establish buy-in, not only at the beginning of the course, but throughout the course. I think that's just going to be a case with specs grading until if it ever becomes so ubiquitous that it's used more often, then they will get more used to it. It also appears that in general, specs seems to increase a student's growth mindset. They seem to want to try again. They talked a lot about how they liked the opportunity to revise and resubmit. We had a lot of quotes about students saying they did feel like they had more ownership and agency over their own grade, which was great because that was something we wanted. So in general, we felt like specs was worth applying, but there were still some things to fix in that students didn't understand the system well. There were challenges with defining the 3-level system and some of the individual criteria on rubrics, but this just points back to specs. Like all of your classes that you were designing, it's going to be an iterative process of trying things and then, trying better, doing something different and trying again the next time. We also wanted to incorporate more revision opportunities to build up the demonstration of proficiency and mastery. Now, I see a lot of questions in the chat. So actually, this is a place where Steve and I are going to pause for a minute and take questions. Their comments reflect how this system rewards good habits, which are life skills. Yes, we definitely try and teach more life skills, at least in most of my classes, beyond just achieving the grade. Steve has been responding in the chat. And I'll address what are the strategies to reduce student anxiety. And a lot of that is buy-in and having them actually do exercises with the student grade tracker throughout the semester or throughout the term to have them physically do it themselves so they can see their progress in the course and then they realize the tool that they have. Okay, at that, I will let Steve take over now.
All right, so for Chem 152, so this is an instrumental analysis class taken by senior chemistry majors. And so it's a combined lecture and lab course. So there are new elements compared to 101W, and then there are also writing assignments, which need to be thought of in the same way as the writing assignments in 101W. Another aspect of this is that it's a larger class, although I'm very lucky with the number of TAs I get. We still don't want to introduce any grading practices that are going to not scale very well. So there is a lot of chemistry content that we need to worry about. And that needs to go into the rubrics. And then there's more different kinds of assignments. So there's in-class work from the lecture, there's quizzes from the lecture, there's lab reports from the lab, pre-lab quizzes and things like that. So my main goal in introducing specifications grading into this class was to give students more revision opportunities for the lab portion. The lecture portion actually didn't change very much. So here are those bundles of assignments. So for the lecture, I have in-class assignments and then basically reading check-ins, complete and incomplete assignments, and then biweekly quizzes. The rest of the stuff is pre-lab assignments, post-lab quizzes, lab reports, and then experimental presentations are meant to replace writing an experimental section in this virtual environment because they didn't actually do the lab. So they have to make a little presentation, but that seems to me to be easier than writing an experimental section about a procedure that you didn't do. So the grade tracker is very similar to the one in 101W. It's a little less straight specifications, I would say, because I do have quizzes that the students take, and I still use their average score to determine their grade. In this case, though, the average score on the quiz is like one of the bundle criteria. So the quizzes just have a bunch of 1-point questions. Each one corresponds to a learning objective that they've gone through in the last 2 weeks that they're supposed to learn. And so it's still a summative assessment. It's not exactly specifications, but there is still a cutoff in the grade tracker for it. So the rubrics, as I mentioned, these things have to have, well, they have a writing component or a communication component, let's say, and content knowledge. They're supposed to display in the lab report that they have analyzed their data correctly and understand the theory behind the experiment, and et cetera. So you can see in the left-hand column here, the first 5 or the first 4 criteria in this case are basically communication questions. Can they format figures correctly? Can they format tables correctly? Did they proofread the thing? Are they writing numbers with uncertainties and the correct number of sig figs and units and all that stuff? But then there are also criteria where we're asking them to demonstrate knowledge of the content. So this specific rubric is for an instrument design lab where they have to build a circuit using electronics. And obviously they don't build it in person, but they do a virtual lab, which is a whole other thing. But so they're on this lab report, there are something like 13 questions, and they're short questions. One of the questions just might be make a figure. One of the questions might be write a paragraph explaining that figure, right? But throughout the lab, they'll do maybe 3 or 4 different questions that have to do with operational amplifier math, making and testing circuits. And so that's only a part of those questions, because those questions might also have a figure in them or might also have a table in them. So when the TA grades, they're not grading question 1, then moving on to question 2, then moving on to question 3. What they're doing is grading criteria, and they're looking for, I give them a grading key. They're looking for the questions that address calorimetry. Has the student performed the calculations in there correctly? And have they interpreted their data correctly? And have they done the math to find the enthalpy of solution correctly, right? So rather than having one criteria for one question, it's one criteria for one concept. And if they get that concept incorrect, but they make the figure with the correct format, then they can get credit for the figure criteria, but they don't get credit for the concept criteria, learning the concept. I also have a token economy in this class, and basically it just revolves around expanded opportunities for revision, but we're taking a lot of time so we can move on to the wrap up for this class. So I'm really happy with specifications grading in this context, but there was a learning process for me. The first time a lot of people got A's, which I'm fine with, really, especially in the context of a pandemic. But I set goals for my students to meet, and they met them. Lots of them met them, which is great. But what that taught me was I could have expected more from them. I could have set those goals higher, and probably a bunch of them would have even gone beyond what I expected of them the first time and learned more from the class. So then I modified the grade tracker accordingly for the current class, and we're 3 weeks in, so we'll see how it goes. 4 weeks in, so we'll see how it goes. The lab reports at the end of this quarter are better than in previous years, noticeably, especially in the context of like people formatting their figures correctly, making really, really simple mistakes that they used to make. They're not doing that anymore. And then every TA that I've had grade reports with this system has commented about how much better they like it than trying to assign partial credit. And more importantly, arguing with students over that partial credit after they released the grades to them. This is very cut and dry. The student didn't make their figure correctly, and the TA can explain figure 4 is wrong for this reason. And then there's not much arguing about that. It's very straightforward. You're not trying to argue over levels of, well, it was almost right, but then you didn't do this. No, it was either correct or incorrect, clear or unclear, formatted well or not formatted. So the TAs like it, the students understand it, and I'm a big proponent.
So on to 204L. When I came to Emory, I ended up teaching a lecture course last semester. This semester, I have redesigned a macromolecules lab. So just real quick context, I won't go through all of these, but this is I designed this lab to be taught in a remote setting because we are in a pandemic. So I had to adjust to teach a lab class online, and I designed it with specifications grading from the get-go. This is a new course in the Chem bound curriculum, and it's essentially similar to a second semester organic chemistry lab, except it's more biochemistry focused, and it's required for chem majors and pre-med students. The major changes are that this is a huge class. This is about 400 students, not quite as big as Renee's 1,000-person plus, but pretty sizable. It's online, more chem content than just writing, and different types of assessments, right? I have a lot of post labs, in labs, and I had a final writing paper. So like Steve, I'm gonna kind of go through this a little bit quickly. We had the same amount, I had the same basic components of the course, a student grade tracker that has my assignment bundles, rubrics that are binary, and that are specifications rubric where each criteria ties to a learning objective, and I instituted a token economy. Now, one note I wanted to make about the token economy is I have TAs who, so I know everyone has different grading expectations. Sometimes you have to grade depending on your institution. Sometimes you have TAs. My TAs work 10 hours a week, which was different for me because at UCI, they work 20 hours. So I had to be strategic about which assignments I wanted students to actually be able to attempt and resubmit. So I stuck to the post-lab assignments because those were assignments that kind of measured a lot of the learning objectives, and that then they were going to translate to the more final components of the course, which were to write a final, like a paper about the experiment that we did in the course. So another thing I wanted to point out here is it was challenging for me to delineate between all of the different plus minus grades. So A plus A minus, B plus B. It was too much, and it was hard for me to actually get gradations between these different bundles. So I did something a little bit differently, and I believe Renee gave me this idea, where I took the assessments where I wasn't measuring discrete learning objectives, and they were assignments that the students had to complete in order to actually help them learn the material. So these were the pre-lab assignments and the in-lab assignments. I decided to grade those for complete, incomplete, and then those will count towards a student's plus minus at the end of the semester or the term. Whereas all of the other assignments that have rubrics attached to them where we're measuring multiple LOs, those were part of what constituted a student earning an A, a B, or a C in the class. And the only thing I wanted to highlight here really was my process of going between the bundles and the grading thresholds and how I did that for this class. So I decided to set a C to having all assignments as a low pass. So I really wanted my students to demonstrate competency in the course to earn a C. I incorporated more high passes into my B to show that they are kind of demonstrating a little bit above and beyond just competency with the material. And then finally in A, it was a combination, mostly high pass where they're demonstrating proficiency, but then some low pass, and you see there are these kind of combinations of high and low pass that can constitute meeting that bundle to earn that grade. And so this is kind of to highlight the challenges that we see sometimes with these high-low pass systems, but in my case, it really worked better because I needed a way to delineate between the final components of the course. If I only had a binary system of pass or no pass, it would have been hard for me to distinguish between an A, a B, and a C. So the wrap up essentially was the same as Steve. I'm going to highlight this last one because I recently surveyed my TAs about this because I was worried about the amount of grading I was having them doing. And they're like, no, actually throughout the semester, it's gotten much better and easier because the students got better. They actually were meeting the objectives because they had to do the same thing so many times. And so it made the grading better and easier. So to wrap up.
Okay, so both of us have said this, and we want to reiterate that using specifications grading has made us like specifications grading more, both on sort of a personal level, like making it easier to design a class and design individual assignments and rubrics, and then based on feedback from our students and from our TAs, which we both have in this class, in these classes. So if you're going to try this, we hope that everybody now has decided, I'm going to make my class a specifications grading class. Kate mentioned the rubrics that we found holes the first time, where students were able to, come up with a combination of scores on an assignment that didn't earn any grade at all based on the grade track. It's going to happen. If you've built a relationship of communication and like caring, or at least having a reputation for flexibility with your students, you can work around that kind of stuff without any huge headaches, unless somehow 100 students fall into the hole, and then neither of us have had that problem happen. But even if students do fall into holes and you have to bump everybody up and give everybody a better grade than maybe you think they deserve, they're still learning a lot, and we think it's because of these clear expectations and the opportunities to revise and keep working towards mastery, and the incentives to keep working towards mastery in the student grade tracker. So to avoid that thing where 100 students fall into some hole, we would recommend spending most of the time developing the grade tracker, figuring out how learning outcomes relate to assignments, and then how those relate to a final grade. And then worry about the individual rubrics and having the perfect criteria for each assignment. We really suggest using a token system. Mine have sort of evolved towards the students, like they don't spend all of their tokens because they have enough opportunities for revision that the ones who want to keep revising have the opportunity to do that are just built into the class. But it really gives the students a feeling of agency, helps with buy-in, and it helps with that relationship, you coming off as somebody who cares about helping them work towards mastery and giving them opportunities to succeed. So we would really recommend that you do it. There are just a few things that you want to think about so that you don't have any huge issues. But neither of us have had any huge issues. Even all of the classes that we've talked about today and more that we haven't have been totally revised all at once, with both feet. So it is possible and it can go very well. So somebody in the chat says, is Grade Tracker an automated tracking tool? That's a great question. And we probably should have put this in here, but the answer is yes. And then how automated it is depends on how much you like programming. So Renee, for example, is an evangelist for R. And so she has automated her grade tracker in R, I believe. Mine is automated in Excel, in an Excel spreadsheet that just uses if statements to and uses the grade cutoffs and the grade tracker. So Renee says that hers is not automated for the students. Mine actually is. I give the students my Excel sheet, like only one row of it, so they can't see anybody else's grades. But then they can put in their numbers of high passes and completes and et cetera, and it'll spit out their grade. So yeah, you can definitely automate this. You can't automate it in Canvas or I'm sure you can't automate it in Blackboard, but you can automate it yourself in Excel or R.
Well, Steve, I have a question, a very quick question. The only thing that, I saw that this system depends a lot on TAs. If we don't have a TA, what will happen?
I mean, so I depend on TAs because I have TAs. Hey, come here. But if I didn't have TAs, I would still use the same system. This grading lab reports is quicker in this system than it is with traditional points-based rubrics because you don't have to try to.
Yes,
So-
but it takes a lot of time, at least the first time that you are doing this. This is the main problem that I have. This is a very good system for grading, but it takes the first time a lot of time. If you don't have anyone to take a look at that, especially for big class. So, and if you want to do this for some specific class, for example, for graduate classes, it takes a lot of time. So my question was that, what will happen? Because now with COVID, we don't have that much financing for these kind of classes. I cannot have a TA. And TAs, sometimes they go their own direction. You cannot tell TAs do this or do that. Unfortunately, they have their own ideas too. So this is another problem.
I can speak to that a little bit. We experienced, so when I first ran the Chem 101W course, the first time we ran specs grading, it was me and another TA. So there were two of us, and luckily we did have the both of us, and there were so many writing assignments that without the two of us, it would have been too much, like you said. Yeah. What I suggest and what I tried to do strategically for my class this semester was, since I had a limited amount of time that my TAs could work for me, I had to split the time between them being in lab in a synchronous session with the students, and then actually grading. And they have like 5 of those 10 hours are technically contact hours where they're in lab or with me or at TA meeting or giving office hours. So I only had them grade assignments that were measuring the learning outcomes that I wanted students to demonstrate. So for all of the other assignments, like the pre-lab and the in-lab and the assignments that the students needed to do to actually learn the material, those were just graded on complete, incomplete. Did the students do it? Did they give it their best effort? Great. Because if they did it well and they actually apply it to the other assignments, like the post-lab assignments, for example, where they have to write about what they did, that is going to demonstrate that they are understanding it. So I think it's a balance of figuring out, okay, how many assignments can you actually have that are graded with rubrics? How many can you punt, if you will, to like incomplete assignments? And then how many revise and resubmission opportunities can you reasonably give? So for mine, I give my students, I think they have like 3 tokens at the beginning of the semester, and they can use a token to try for a revise and resubmit. And so at the beginning of the semester, many students end up using those, and then it falls off as you go. So this doesn't necessarily address your concern of it's a lot of work, because it's a little bit more work at the beginning and then it kind of falls off. And I haven't really found a good system for that besides just limiting the amount of tokens you give them at first. So then they have to be strategic and decide, okay, do I actually want to reattempt and resubmit all 5 of my first post labs, or should I hold on and try again on 1 or 2? Because another aspect of my course is I'm not looking for perfection. I'm not looking for them to get high passes on 100% of my assignments. They can actually pass the class with an A and not submit 1 to 2 post labs. Because if they have gotten high passes on 7 of the 9 post labs, that is the majority of assignments. And those are often the later assignments. So they have demonstrated that they have learned something. So I feel like you kind of have to decide what's important, go back to your objectives, and then strategically apply the specs grading tools to try and minimize the amount of grading for you in this case, if you're the one who's going to have to do it all.